20 Curiosities about the life of Anne Boleyn. Today you will discover the fascinating and tragic life of one of the most enigmatic figures in English history. Daughter of a diplomat and educated in the most refined courts of Europe, and not only won the heart of King Henry VIII but also forever changed the course of England by provoking a break with the Catholic Church. From lady-in-waiting to queen consort, her rise was marked by cunning, charisma, and an ambition that defied the norms of her time. However, her story is also a reflection of the dangers of power in a court dominated by intrigue, betrayal, and unchecked passions. In this video, we reveal the key moments of her life, from her childhood to her tragic end in the Tower of London. Before we dive in, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Without further ado, let's begin. Birth around 1501. The exact date of Anne Boleyn's birth remains a topic of debate among historians, although most agree it occurred around the year 1501. Some less accepted sources propose 1507, but the circumstantial records of her education and later activities make the former more likely. Daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard, and came from a family with influential connections both at court and in the English nobility. Her exact birthplace is also uncertain, disputed between two family estates, Blickling Hall in the county of Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent. Both residences were centres of aristocratic activity and provided a suitable environment for the upbringing of a young noblewoman. Anne's lineage combined political ambition, recent wealth, and ties to the high aristocracy, ingredients that would prove fundamental in her rise within the Tudor court. Education in the Netherlands and France. Anne Boleyn received an unusual education for an Englishwoman of her time. From a young age, she was sent to the European continent, initially to the Netherlands, where she was welcomed into the refined court of Margaret of Austria, daughter of Emperor Maximilian I and regent of the Netherlands. There, Anne stood out for her sharp intelligence and her ability to learn languages and courtly manners. Later, her path took her to France, where she served in the court of Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. During her time in France, and absorbed the sophisticated customs of the Renaissance, she mastered the art of conversation, the fashion of the time, courtly dance, and developed a deeper understanding of Christian humanism, influences that would shape her future thinking. Returned to England in 1522. In the year 1522, Anne Boleyn returned to her homeland after several years of education in Europe. Her return was motivated by her appointment as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, first wife of King Henry VIII. Upon arriving at the English court, Anne brought with her a distinctive style and attitude. Her clothing followed French fashion, she spoke several languages fluently, and she carried herself confidently in the most demanding social settings. Her presence did not go unnoticed. The English court, accustomed to a more traditional model of noblewoman, saw in Anne a modern and magnetic figure. While serving the Queen, Anne began to integrate into the complex power networks of the Tudor court, where influence, discretion, and intelligence were as valuable as lineage. In this environment, the young noblewoman began to attract the attention of powerful men, setting in motion a destiny that would change the history of England. Frustrated engagement with Henry Percy. Among Anne Boleyn's early romantic connections, her relationship with Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland, stands out. Young Percy, impressed by Anne's elegance and personality, developed a romantic relationship with her during their time at court. According to several contemporary accounts, the two even became informally engaged. However, Anne's social rise was not welcomed by all. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, then chief advisor to King Henry VIII, intervened directly to dissolve the engagement. It has been suggested that Henry VIII himself was already showing interest in Anne, which would explain Wolsey's decisive actions. The marriage was forbidden, Percy was forced to marry another woman for political reasons, and Anne, humiliated, developed a deep resentment toward the cardinal. This episode marked a turning point in her view of the court and its power games, showing her how fragile her position was in the face of royal interests. Henry VIII falls in love with her around 1525. It was around the year 1525 that Anne Boleyn caught the attention of King Henry VIII, beginning one of the most consequential relationships in English history. Henry, used to getting what he wanted, was intrigued by Anne's resistance. She did not allow herself to be easily seduced. Unlike many women who had yielded to the monarch's power, Anne stood firm, refusing to become his mistress. This refusal only fueled the king's desire. Henry was fascinated not only by her unconventional beauty, dark complexion, dark eyes, and slender figure, but also by her intelligence, political insight, and ability to converse with powerful men as an equal. Anne knew how to turn this interest into an opportunity. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her queen. This strategy altered the course of events, initiating a long and conflictive struggle with the Church of Rome and setting in motion a religious reform that would reshape the very structure of power in England. She faced criticism from a deeply Catholic society. During the years when Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn ceased to be a secondary figure at court and became the center of an unprecedented political and personal crisis. She actively participated in the strategy to achieve the annulment, aware that her future depended on Catherine's departure. She supported reformist ideas and encouraged the king to act without waiting for the Pope's consent. Catherine, for her part, refused to yield, intensifying the conflict, and faced the criticism of a deeply Catholic society and the rejection directed at one who dared to challenge a consecrated queen. Over time, she became a symbol of the coming change, even though she had not yet worn the crown. The annulment, long and controversial, was the first step toward her rise. She was the direct cause of the schism with Rome. Henry VIII, after years of frustration and fruitless negotiations with the papacy, made a radical decision. In 1533, with the support of his advisors and the English Parliament, he ordered the national clergy to recognize his authority over that of the Pope. This led to the formal creation of the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, under the Act of Supremacy of 1534. The king declared himself the supreme head of the new religious institution. While tensions with Rome had deeper roots, it was his relationship with Anne Boleyn that precipitated the final rupture, and was the object of the king's desire and represented a new political and spiritual era that displaced centuries of obedience to papal authority. She secretly married Henry in January of 1533. At the beginning of 1533, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were secretly married. At that time, the annulment process of his first marriage to Catherine had not yet been legally resolved, making this union not only clandestine but politically explosive. It has been documented that the ceremony took place on January 25, in the presence of a small circle of loyal individuals. Anne was already pregnant, which added urgency to the union. Henry wished to ensure that his child with Anne would be born within marriage and recognized as legitimate. Soon after, Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury and an ally of the king, declared the marriage to Catherine null and validated the union with Anne, solidifying the religious transformation taking place in the kingdom. She was crowned queen in June of 1533. On June 1 of 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen Consort of England in a lavish ceremony held at Westminster Abbey. The event was designed to legitimize her position as the king's wife and to solidify the new power structure Henry had established. The coronation included a significant detail, and was anointed with the crown of Saint Edward the Confessor, a piece traditionally reserved for reigning monarchs, not consorts. This sent a clear message about the magnitude of her new status. The celebration lasted 4 days, with banquets, parades, and public festivities, although popular enthusiasm was limited. Many in the kingdom remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon and saw Anne as a usurper. However, for Henry, the coronation was a solemn affirmation that Anne was now the legitimate queen, and that any religious or political opposition was secondary to his authority as supreme head of the new Church of England. She gave birth to Elizabeth I in September of 1533. On September 7 of 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth at Greenwich Palace. The kingdom awaited the birth of a male heir with great anticipation, but the outcome was a girl, Elizabeth. Although her birth was met with some disappointment by her father, the infant was proclaimed princess, and arrangements were made to raise her as heir. And, for her part, did not hide her disappointment, though she soon became convinced she still had time to bear a son. Elizabeth's birth was a key moment in Anne's personal story and a turning point for the nation. That child, born in a time of deep religious and political tension, would decades later become Elizabeth I, one of the most iconic and powerful monarchs in English history. At that time, however, Anne's failure to produce a male heir began to erode her position at court, and the king's patience began to waver. She suffered several miscarriages. After the birth of Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn experienced a series of failed pregnancies that severely weakened her standing as consort. Between 1534 and 1536, she suffered at least 2 miscarriages, one of which, according to contemporary witnesses, may have been a male child lost in January of 1536. This last loss was especially devastating for both her and Henry VIII. In a context where male succession was seen as essential for dynastic stability, these failures began to erode the king's hope of obtaining a male heir through Anne. Each miscarriage increased the monarch's discontent, and he began to doubt whether Anne could fulfill the promise that had elevated her to the throne, to give him a son. She was an unpopular queen. Despite her position as queen, Anne Boleyn never managed to win the affection of the English people. In many sectors of society, she was viewed with contempt, and criticism of her figure was constant. The population, deeply Catholic and loyal to the deposed Queen, Catherine of Aragon, blamed Anne for destroying a legitimate marriage and for provoking the break with Rome. Cruel nicknames such as the Great Whore of the King circulated among both commoners and the corridors of nobility. Furthermore, her strong character and direct manner of speaking made her unpopular among other members of the court. She was perceived as haughty, ambitious, and even ruthless. Her meteoric rise and her influence over Henry generated envy and enmity, even among former allies. Unlike the idealized image of a submissive consort, Anne exercised power and opinion in political and religious matters, which clashed with the traditional standards of her time. She had a rivalry with Jane Seymour. The arrival of Jane Seymour into the king's close circle marked a turning point in the relationship between Anne and Henry VIII. Jane, also a lady-in-waiting, emerged as a quiet but skillful figure, cultivating an image of modesty that contrasted with Anne's dominant energy. Henry began to show interest in her around 1535, and by early 1536 it was evident that Jane had captured the king's affection. Anne perceived the threat and faced this new situation with growing anxiety. The rivalry between the two women was neither open nor direct, but it was charged with symbolic tension. While Anne lost royal favor and suffered miscarriages, Jane gained ground with a strategy of apparent submission and patience. Henry saw in Jane a more docile alternative, possibly more suited to securing an heir. This new relationship was one of the key elements that facilitated Anne's final downfall. She was arrested in May of 1536. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested in Greenwich and taken by barge along the Thames to the Tower of London. The order was executed swiftly, and her arrest marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic trials in the history of the English monarchy. The formal charges were adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king's life. Anne arrived at the Tower in a state of confusion and anguish, unable to grasp the magnitude of the plot against her. The King's Privy Council, led by Thomas Cromwell, had gathered dubious testimonies and fabricated a case to justify her elimination. Henry, determined to break with her, no longer showed signs of affection or doubt. The Queen was confined in the very rooms that once welcomed her for her coronation, now turned into her prison. The message was clear: Anne's dazzling rise had come to an end. She was accused of incest with her brother George Boleyn. One of the most scandalous charges presented against Anne Boleyn was the accusation that she had maintained an incestuous relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The accusation was part of the judicial process designed to ensure her conviction. Although there was no tangible evidence to support such a crime, the mere allegation caused deep shock. George was arrested and tried separately, and although he defended himself firmly, he was found guilty along with other men close to the Queen. Many historians agree that this charge was absurd and part of a maneuver orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell and other enemies of the Boleyns to discredit and eliminate the entire family. The accusation of incest was not only intended to morally tarnish Anne, but also to strip her of any legitimacy as the mother of Princess Elizabeth, sowing doubts about her lineage. 5 men were executed for relations with her. The case against Anne Boleyn was not solely an attack on her, but a purge also aimed at her inner circle. 5 men were accused of having had sexual relations with the Queen and of participating in supposed plots against the King's life. They were found guilty in swift trials and executed between the 17th and 18th of May, 1536. These deaths served to reinforce the case against Anne and to eliminate potential supporters. The use of the judicial apparatus as an instrument of political elimination was a clear feature of this episode, where truth was subordinated to the King's interests. She was declared guilty on May 15, 1536. Anne Boleyn's trial was held on May 15, 1536, inside the Tower of London, in the King's Hall. Presided over by her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the court was made up mostly of nobles hostile to her. The trial was public, but its outcome was already decided. Although Anne defended her innocence with eloquence and firmness, the charges, adultery, incest, and treason, were deemed sufficient by the jury to condemn her to death. No solid evidence was presented. Many of the alleged encounters occurred on dates when Anne was not even in the same locations as the accused. She was granted a merciful execution. Once the death sentence was passed, Henry VIII granted Anne an unusual mercy. Instead of being executed by axe, the usual method in England, he ordered an expert executioner to be brought from Calais to use a sword. This choice, though seemingly merciful, was also a display of power and control. The French executioner was known for his precision and ability to execute without prolonged suffering. During the days leading up to her death, she showed remarkable self-control and prepared herself through prayer. This calm and resigned preparation surprised even her jailers. The choice of the sword, an unusual instrument, ultimately sealed the tragic and unique aura of her end. She was executed on May 19, 1536. On May 19, shortly before noon, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold within the Tower of London. Dressed in a simple grey gown and a cloak of ermine, she walked with steady steps and a serene gaze. In her final speech, she expressed no resentment nor challenged those who had condemned her. On the contrary, she asked God to protect the King, whom she called a good and gentle Lord. These words have been interpreted as an act of dignity, resignation, or even pragmatism, as any reproach could have endangered her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. She knelt on the makeshift platform, and without need for a pillow or restraints, prepared for the blow. The executioner, hiding the sword to avoid disturbing her, performed his task swiftly. Thus ended the life of a woman who had been queen, reformer, mother, and symbol of a turbulent era. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. After her execution, Anne Boleyn's body was placed in a simple wooden box, said to have been an old arrow chest, and buried without any formal ceremony in the Royal Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located within the very Tower of London. At that time, her grave was not marked with a headstone. For centuries, her resting place remained anonymous, hidden beneath the stone floor of the chapel. It was not until the 19th century, during a restoration led by Queen Victoria, that the approximate location of her remains was identified. A plaque with her name and titles was then placed. The choice of that chapel as her final resting place, alongside others executed during the reign of Henry VIII, was a practical decision, but also a symbolic one. Anne, who had been a central figure in the most significant religious and political shift of her century, was buried in silence, without honors or official mourning. And yet, the passage of time would turn her into an enduring figure in English history. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. Give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more historical content.